In today's essential task, we are going to begin Unit 7. Unit 7 involves looking at a phenomenon called behavioral psychology or behaviorism. It is the orange color-coded column in the class and is technically the last color-coded column for us to talk about. The first essential task in Unit 7 involves looking at a phenomenon known as classical conditioning. It is one of several phenomenons that we're going to talk about in the early portion of this unit that tries to explain different ways in which humans and other animals also learn. The concept map today looks slightly different only due to the fact that because this is the first essential task, we need to define behaviorism. It needs to go somewhere. And it didn't seem like it made a lot of sense to make a one-box concept map that just said define behaviorism. So we're going to define behaviorism. It's this box here at the top. And then the primary focus of our concept map today is here on the left under classical conditioning, but specifically under process. So it's the four boxes that you see top down here all the way to the left, acknowledging that the box all the way at the bottom's a little long. You'll see when we get there in a little bit. It's a little bit of an unorthodox looking box, but it will make a lot more sense when we get there. How I would do this concept map is I would take behaviorism, put it sort of right in the center at the very top of my piece of paper, and then start the classical conditioning portion right below it. But I'll return now to the text task, allow you to copy down the portion in yellow. All right, so let's begin by first defining behaviorism. By definition, behavioral psychology or behaviorism is the scientific study of learned observable behaviors. So somebody raises their hand in class. A behavioral psychologist would be curious as to what motivated that behavior. How did that person learn to raise their hand? When somebody obeys a speed limit, you can very clearly see them driving at the speed limit. What has, over the course of their life, influenced that behavior? When your dog or cat comes running because they hear a familiar sound that they've heard throughout their entire life. Maybe that's the opening of a can or the opening of a drawer or the opening of a closet. Why do they run towards you? Why do they experience physiological changes? Why does their heart rate increase? That would be a question that a behavioral psychologist would try and answer. And there's really three primary ways that behavioral psychologists answer those types of questions. The first is through what's called the classical conditioning. I like to refer to it as flowchart. So we're going to call it the classical conditioning flowchart. We're going to introduce that in just a few moments when we get to the classical conditioning portion of this concept map. And we're also going to talk about classical conditioning in 7.2. The second method of which behavioral psychologists often cite is what's called operant condition. It's something we're going to talk about in essential tasks 3 and 4. It's an explanation of behavior predicated on the idea that rewards and punishments, what we call reinforcement and punishment, influence our behavior. And then towards the end of the unit, we're going to talk about observational learning, which is in many ways what it sounds like, explaining how individuals watch another person exhibit a behavior and then model their own behavior. They replicate or imitate that behavior. Essentially, this is a unit that tries to explain in a scientific way how we learn our clearly observable behaviors. So not our thinking, right? You can't observe thinking. So there's no reference to cognition, at least primarily during this unit. So our friend Mr. Cognition can be pushed off to the side. This is very much why we carry out behaviors that are clearly observable. Raising our hand, driving the speed limit, etc. We're going to begin, as I alluded to, all the way here on the left region of the concept map with the classical conditioning portion, and we're only doing process. This applications is its own concept map. We're only doing this process part. So classical conditioning is a phenomenon that occurs, and as we alluded to a moment ago, each of the conditionings, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and then subsequently observational learning, are examples of ways in which we learn. They are all somewhat different, though, and apply in different settings. When we learn through classical conditioning, what happens is something that previously meant absolutely positively nothing to us, like a song or a sound or a smell or color, begins to automatically elicit a brand new response. So, for example, at one point in your life, you had never heard the theme song to Jaws, but I'm going to guess many of you, even if you've never seen the movie, are familiar with the soundtrack to Jaws. I'll play it in class for those of you who are unfamiliar. I don't want to play it here. My video would probably be taken down for copyright infringement. But you've probably at this point in your life heard the song to the theme of Jaws. Well, at one point in your life, maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago, 13 years ago, that song meant absolutely nothing to you. You could hear it and you're like, this is an ominous song, but I don't feel anything unique. I don't think of anything. Nothing comes to mind. However, at one point in your life, you probably heard the theme song to Jaws in the context of either the movie or a clip or just having familiarity with the movie. And now, as a result, at the age of 17 or 18 years old, when you hear that song, which at one point in your life meant absolutely nothing, it's almost impossible not to feel anxious or not to at least think of sharks. At some point in your life, you underwent what's called classical conditioning, where something in the world, some stimulus that at one point meant absolutely nothing, a song, has, through the process of what's called classical conditioning, been able to elicit a brand new automatic response. We're going to focus on the process involved in going from absolutely meaningless to eliciting an automatic response. And that's the key to classical conditioning. The responses are automatic. As you will see in class, we're going to try and do a few different demos that illustrate classical conditioning. Here's just a debrief of one of them, but we'll try and replicate that in class. Continuing onward, there are 3 remaining boxes, though I do stress the bottom box is quite a bit long. We'll have to leave a good amount of space there at the bottom. So just to carry on classical conditioning, I know it's odd to have a second box with the same label, but we're going to, in this box, cite the specific psychologist and his study that really stumbled upon, quite frankly, accidentally, the phenomenon of classical conditioning. That's key psychologist Ivan Pavlov. You might recognize in my class, it's to the left of the agenda currently, the way my class is designed right now, but it is a sign that says the name Pavlov rings a bell. And you may have seen that sign and been curious as to what that meant. Well, it is here. We'll talk about that. Pavlov, working not in psychology, but more in physiology, stumbled upon the phenomenon of classical conditioning while working with dogs. What he was trying to do was measure salivation, how much dogs drooled, and he accidentally discovered this classical conditioning phenomenon because what he found was when he attached a tube to their face and presented them with food, they would obviously start drooling, their dogs. But as time progressed, as he entered the room, he noticed that the tube that was attached to their face already had drool on it, and he was curious. The intent of my study was to determine how much dogs drooled while eating, but now the tube is filled with drool before the animals even been presented with food. Why are they salivating? Those dogs were classically conditioned. Why? Because they associated both his presence, also the environment, and eventually stimulus like bells and sounds and metronomes to mean food was on the way. And they learned to associate these environmental stimulus with the anticipation of food. So they automatically started drooling. Why? Because in many ways they were taught the presence of Dr. Pavlov means I'm going to be fed. Now my body is going to respond automatically. You don't control your salivation. You don't control your drooling. These dogs were automatically doing it because they had learned that his presence meant food was close to being provided. Now, Pavlov went one step further because this discovery obviously was quite curious to him. He went another step further and began to test whether or not he could produce salivation in dogs using other stimuli. So, for example, he used most commonly cited a bell, where he presented the dog with food, day one, right? Dog had never met him before, presented the dog with food. Well, the dog's going to drool. Presented the dog with food, the dog's going to drool. Then he was curious. He rang a bell and noticed that the bell would do nothing. But then he started to pair those two together, where he rang a bell, gave the dog food. Rang the bell, gave the dog food. Rang the bell, gave the dog food. That's called the pairing process. You do that long enough, the dog is going to learn that the bell means food is close to arrival. Want to guess what the dogs ended up ultimately doing? They learned to salivate to the sound of the bell. The bell became what we're going to call in just a few moments a conditioned stimulus that now all alone was able to produce salivation. Meaning Pavlov could ring a bell with no intention to give the dogs food, but the dogs would actually start drooling. They wouldn't be able to control it. It was an automatic response that they had been taught. They were classically conditioned to salivate to the sound of the bell. Please watch the clip that you see here in the top. Watch the entirety of it. It's only a few minutes long. It's an old video, but I think it's the best visual for this phenomenon. Soon after the work of Pavlov was published, a contemporary, John B. Watson, conducted a similar study, but he found instead that humans could be classically conditioned, right? Pavlov focused on animals. Watson took it a little bit further and showed that not only could dogs and animals be classically conditioned to, for example, salivate to the sound of a bell, but humans could also be classically conditioned. He conducted the famous Baby Albert study. You can watch the clip here in the top right corner. You'll see some of the visuals that go along with this, but it's a pretty basic setup. Baby Albert, young infant, was exposed to a bunch of, for the most part, animals that he had never seen before. Rats, dogs, monkeys, and baby Albert, a young infant, just kind of sat there curious, what the heck are these things? I've never seen them before. So he clearly demonstrated at the beginning of the study, baby Albert was not originally afraid of these animals. He had clearly no response, as you will see in the clip. Then what he did is he presented baby Albert with these animals again, one by one, and every time baby Albert went to touch, for example, the rat, baby Albert or his colleagues would hit a loud bar in the back, producing a really loud sound designed to make the baby cry. So now every time the baby reached for an animal, bang, baby cries. Baby Albert reaches for an animal, bang, baby cries. Then in the aftermath of that, in the aftermath of what we call the pairing process, whenever baby Albert was around animals, like rats, for example, he would cry, or rabbits, for example, he would start to cry. Baby Albert was classically conditioned and developed a fear response to the presence of the animals in the study. And now, outside of the experiment, no loud sounds, no nothing. If he was in the presence of an animal, he would cry, and it was automatic. The whole point of classical conditioning is that you don't really control the responses. They are automatic responses that you're, in the case of baby Albert, that baby Albert developed. Why? Because during the pairing process of the study, the loud sound that produced his crying was paired with these animals that clearly at one point in time were just totally neutral. Watson took the time to show and indicate that baby Albert had no response to these animals originally. But after the pairing process, after the experiment was conducted, after the study was finished, now baby Albert is afraid and is producing this automatic fear response. Watson gets credited for really founding the term behavioral psychology. So in addition to conducting the baby Albert study, which carried Pavlov's work into the human domain, he's also credited for dubbing the name behaviorism or behavioral psychology. The final thing is to talk about the process. I've alluded to some of the steps involved here as we were just talking, but we're going to get into the very specific 3 steps. I call this the classical conditioning flowchart, and it's going to look a little overwhelming, and it might seem weird, but I promise if you practice it a couple times, as we're going to do in class, it typically makes sense after you use it a few times. Some people just get it like that. They're like, oh, this is easy. Other cases, it might take a few tries, but I'm confident you'll be able to break down this flowchart. In terms of putting it into your concept map, I'm going to show you how much text is on here. That way you can sort of appropriately position your concept map. There's not an exorbitant amount of text on each of these levels. As you can see, it's in some cases only a few different words. But each of these 3 boxes, this yellow box here at the top with before conditioning, the green one in the middle labeled pairing, and then the blue one labeled after conditioning, supposed to indicate the 3 steps involved that explain how Pavlov's dog started to salivate to a bell, how baby Albert cried in the presence of animals, how the theme to Jaws might produce fear. We'll start all the way at the top with the before conditioning phase. The way classical conditioning works is before the process occurs, there needs to be some type of stimulus that produces an automatic response. So, for example, the presence of sharks, not a movie, just the concept of being around a shark, the presence of a shark is automatically going to trigger fear in a human. I don't think any of us would be willing to go into the ocean when there's clearly a shark in there. People often go out of their way to avoid sharks. It is inherent in human behavior to fear threats such as sharks. That would be classified as an unconditioned stimulus, the shark acting as a stimulus. When you are in the presence of a shark, it is automatically going to trigger the response of fear. We call that response the unconditioned response. You don't have to learn it. The word conditioned is going to be used as a synonym for learning. So in many ways, this is the unlearned stimulus and the unlearned response. A shark is always going to cause fear. A loud sound is always going to cause crying in a child, at least more often than not. The presence of food is going to cause drooling in animals. They can't control it. It's automatic. In addition to that automatic sort of cause and effect relationship here at the first level, there's also something called the neutral stimulus. That's the stimulus at the beginning of the study. Again, this is before conditioning. At the beginning of the study, that doesn't cause anything. So, for example, the theme song to Jaws, which I have denoted here with the music notes, is not going to cause any unique response if you've never heard it before and you have no idea what the context is. You won't automatically think of sharks if you hear the theme song to Jaws. You need to actually have seen the movie, or at least seen a clip of the movie, in order to have that association. So at one point in life, that song meant absolutely positively nothing to you. We consider that the neutral stimulus. For baby Albert, those animals were at one point neutral. As you saw in the clip, he didn't respond at the beginning. In the context of Pavlov's study, specifically if we used the bell version, that bell at the beginning wouldn't do anything to the dogs. The dogs would hear the bell and nothing would happen. They wouldn't drool, nothing. At the beginning. That's important. At the beginning. The first time Pavlov ever met those dogs, nothing happened when he rang the bell. But when you proceed into the pairing phase, where you do both the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus at more or less the same time. Typically, it's neutral stimulus, brief second, like actually 1 second, presentation of the unconditioned stimulus. So, for example, the song in the Jaws movies, the theme. A few minutes later, a few moments later, really, a shark typically appears in the movie. So you hear the music and then a shark. Music, then a shark. Music, then a shark. Now you watch the movie long enough, you know when you hear that song, you're about to see a shark. Let's go to the Pavlov study. The bell, give the dogs food. Bell, give the dogs food. Bell, give the dogs food. The bell has to go first, though. Once the bell goes first and the presentation of food is there, the dogs in that case are going to drool. Using the Jaws theme song, you're going to feel fear because you know a shark's about to appear, or a shark does appear. That process is called pairing, where the unconditioned stimulus, the stimulus that always automatically causes a response, is presented with the neutral stimulus, the stimulus that, again, at least at the beginning, means nothing. Notice I'm using some of these abbreviations, NS, US, UR, to represent some of the stages. See, neutral stimulus, NS, and now NS down here. That's what that means. You do that long enough. By the end of it, and this is the final box in our concept map, by the end of it, you're going to produce a new learned, conditioned behavior. This is the after conditioning phase, where what was once neutral, the Bell and Pavlov study, the Animal and Watson study, the theme song to Jaws, now produces a brand new conditioned response, a response that was not present in the organism at the beginning of the study or at the beginning of the experience. So in this case, the music to the Jaws song, the music to the Jaws theme, rather, the bell, the presence of animals, now produces on its own, and that's the key, a new conditioned response, what we call the CR, the conditioned response. So, for example, you hear the theme song to Jaws, you experience fear. Even if there's no sharks present, even if you're not watching the movie, if you're just walking down the street and you hear that music in the background, you're going to think of sharks. You can't control it. It's automatic. Now Pavlov's dogs can hear a bell outside of the lab, back in their home, and they might salivate because they've associated a bell with a presentation of food, even if their caregivers have no intention whatsoever of feeding them. Baby Albert has been hard to track. I do not believe this is what ended up ultimately happening. There's really no evidence to suggest that, but maybe baby Albert grew up, and at the age of 5, whenever he saw a rabbit or a raccoon or a bunny or a squirrel, got afraid, and he couldn't control it. Obviously, the loud sound is gone, but he associated that loud sound with animals, and now he's afraid. This is a great explanation for how fear responses are formed. Now that you've seen all of these steps, I want to stress a couple things. I want you to notice. All the way on the right, the response actually stays the same on each level. Fear, fear, and then fear. The neutral stimulus also occurs on all 3 steps. The music at the beginning, having ever seen that movie, is neutral. The neutral stimulus in the second phase obviously is getting paired with the shark in the movie. And then at the very end, you notice the NS changes in terminology. The NS turns into the CS on the last step. Fear itself remains on each of the 3 phases, but do note at the very end, because the fear on the final step is no longer fear of sharks, it's fear of the music. Because there's a distinction there, we're no longer going to call it the unconditioned response, because clearly, in order to be afraid of music, you need to have learned that. You need to have experienced something that produced that outcome. So now we call it the conditioned response. Again, conditioned is a synonym for this unit primarily for the word learned. This is the learned stimulus, the music, and the learned response. One final example. The concept map itself is going to use sharks and the theme song to Jaws, but we're going to again use, let's say, Pavlov's study. Food always automatically causes drooling. So food would go here, and then drooling would be the response. At the beginning of the study, before conditioning, the bell was neutral, did absolutely nothing. During the pairing phase, the NS is still the bell. The bell was presented, then immediately after Pavlov gave his dogs food. That's the pairing process. The dogs are going to drool. Why? Because food is still present, right? If food is there, the dogs are always going to drool no matter what. You do this process long enough, that bell, which was once neutral, is going to shift from the neutral stimulus to the conditioned stimulus, because now the dogs are going to have learned what the bell means. And now the dogs can't even control it. It just happens. It's automatic. Now the bells alone are sufficient to produce what was originally the unconditioned response. What was originally the response to the food is now produced not just to the food, but to the bell alone. And because now it's going to occur to just the bell, even if there's no food present, even if no food is given, we classify that now as the conditioned response.